There is a particular sound a screen door makes when someone on the other side decides not to let you in. It doesn't slam. It clicks. Soft. Almost polite. That click is the last thing I heard from the inside of my mother's house on the worst night of my life, and I stood on the welcome mat she'd owned since I was in middle school with 2 suitcases, a laundry basket full of my kids' shoes, and a 4-year-old asleep on my shoulder who was getting heavier by the second. My sister was laughing, not cruelly, which somehow made it worse. She was laughing the easy way you laugh when someone else's disaster has nothing to do with you. My brother had already turned back toward the television. And my father, who used to carry me on his shoulders at the county fair so I could see over the crowd, looked at the floor when he told me there wasn't room. I didn't cry. I want you to know that right up front, because the crying isn't the part that matters. What matters is the thing I decided while I stood there holding my sleeping son, watching the porch light flick off behind me before I'd even reached the bottom step. I decided I would never knock on that door again. Not that one. Not any door where I had to beg to be wanted. My name is Marin. 18 months ago, I had a life that looked fine from the road. That's the honest way to say it. Fine from the road. I was 36. I had 3 kids and a husband, and a house with a mortgage we could mostly afford if nothing broke. My oldest, Nadia, was 11 and already smarter than me in the ways that scared me a little, the kind of kid who noticed everything and said almost none of it. Theo was 7, all elbows and questions, obsessed with maps and the exact distance between things, and Junie was 4, still small enough to fall asleep mid-sentence, still convinced that if she couldn't see you, you couldn't see her. Their father was named Roland. We'd been married 9 years. I met him when I was 25, and I thought he was the most certain person I had ever encountered, and it took me most of a decade to understand that certainty and honesty are not the same thing. Roland was a regional manager for a company that installed commercial flooring. He traveled a lot. He was charming at dinner parties and short-tempered in parking lots, and he had a way of making every problem in our marriage feel like a decision I had made alone. I want to be fair to him for exactly 1 paragraph, because after this I won't bother. He was not violent. He did not scream. He remembered the kids' birthdays, and he was good at the fun parts of parenting, the wrestling and the ice cream, the parts that get applause. What he was not good at was any of the quiet work, the pediatrician appointments, the forms, the 3 a.m. fevers, the knowing which kid was allergic to what. That was all me. For 9 years, all of it was me, and I told myself that was just how marriages divided up, that everyone carried a load like this, until the day I found out he'd been carrying a whole second life the entire time. I didn't catch him through some big dramatic scene. I caught him because he asked me to look up a confirmation number on his tablet while he was driving, and a message thread was already open, and I read 4 lines I was never supposed to read. That was all. 4 lines. 9 years of my life reorganize themselves in the time it takes to read 4 lines at a red light with your kids arguing in the back seat about whose turn it was to pick the music. I'm not going to walk you through the weeks after that. Some things belong to me and not to a story. What I'll tell you is that I tried, briefly, to believe the version of events where we fixed it, because that's what you're supposed to do, and because I had 3 kids who loved him. But the trying felt like holding my breath underwater. Eventually, your body just decides for you. By the middle of March, I had talked to a lawyer, and by the end of March, I had told Roland I was done, and he moved into a short-term rental across town without much of a fight, which told me everything about how much he'd been planning this too. And that's when I made the mistake I want to warn you about. I called my family. I grew up believing I came from close people. My parents, Diane and Gerald, had been married 39 years. They went to church. They hosted Easter. My mother had a wall of framed school photos going up the staircase, 1 for every year, all 4 of us kids marching up the wall in ascending order of front teeth. My brother Curtis was 34 and still lived in the house he was born in. In the basement, he'd converted into what he called his setup, which meant a very large television and a mini fridge. And my sister Whitney was 30, married 18 months, and had recently developed the confidence of a woman who thinks a wedding is the same thing as wisdom. I called my mother first. I told her about Roland, the 4 lines, the lawyer, all of it. I told her I needed a soft place to land for a few weeks while I got the kids settled and figured out the house situation. I said I could take the basement or the guest room or honestly the floor. I wasn't proud about it. I just needed a few weeks of not being alone with it. There was a pause on the line. I have replayed that pause more times than I'd like to admit. It wasn't a shocked pause. It wasn't a heartbroken pause. It was the pause of somebody deciding how to say no. "Well," she said, "you know we don't really have the room, Marin." I want to be precise here because precision is the only revenge I allowed myself for a long time. My parents have a 4-bedroom house. My childhood bedroom had been turned into what my mother called a sewing room, which meant it held a sewing machine she used twice a year and a daybed. There was Curtis's basement. There was a whole finished space above the garage that my father had built and then never figured out what to do with. There was room. There was so much room that I had slept in that house every holiday of my entire adult life without anyone once mentioning a shortage of it. "Mom," I said, "I have the kids. I just need a little time." "I think you're moving too fast," she said. "Marriages go through things. Roland is a good provider. Have you really thought about what this does to those children?" I had thought about almost nothing else. That was the thing. I'd thought about my children so hard and so constantly that I'd nearly forgotten I was a person too. And here was my own mother implying I hadn't considered them, that leaving a man who'd been lying to me for years was the reckless choice, that staying was the responsible one. I didn't argue. I said I'd come by the next morning and we could talk about it in person. She said that was fine in the voice she uses when nothing is fine. I drove over the next day with all 3 kids because I didn't have anyone to leave them with, which, if you're keeping track, was the entire problem. I pulled into the driveway I'd learned to ride a bike in. I walked up the porch steps I'd sat on through 100 summer evenings, and my father opened the door before I could knock, which meant they'd seen me pull in, which meant they'd been waiting. "Marin," he said, and then nothing for a second. My dad is not a hard man, or he wasn't growing up. But he stood in that doorway like a man reading from a script somebody else had written, and I realized that whatever was about to happen had already been decided in a conversation I wasn't part of. "Your mom and I talked it over," he said, "and we don't think it's the right time for you to stay here." "Dad." My voice came out thin. Nadia was standing right beside me, holding Junie's hand, and I hated that she was hearing this. "I don't have anywhere to go. The house is tied up until the divorce settles. I just need a couple weeks." "You could try to work things out with Roland," he said. "For the kids." Behind him I heard my brother's voice float up from the couch, casual, like he was commenting on a football play. "There's genuinely no room here, Mare. You know how it is." Curtis, who was 34 years old, who paid no rent, who occupied an entire floor of the house, told me there was no room. And then he laughed a little, at his own joke or at me, I couldn't tell, and my father didn't correct him. Whitney appeared in the hallway like she'd been waiting in the wings for her scene, arms folded, head tilted. She had a way of tilting her head when she was about to be condescending, and 18 months of marriage had made her an expert. "Honestly, Marin," she said, "I think this is a huge overreaction. Roland made a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. You have 3 kids to think about, and their whole world is about to blow up because of a decision you're making for yourself. A decision I was making for myself. I looked at my sister, 22 months into her own marriage, standing in our parents' hallway with our father's silence backing her up, and I understood something with total clarity. They were not confused about the situation. They understood it perfectly. They simply preferred the version where I was the problem, because that version required nothing from them. "Thanks for the advice," I said. My voice was so calm it scared me a little. I picked up the laundry basket of shoes. I got my 3 kids back into a car with a check engine light I'd been ignoring for a month, and I backed out of the driveway I'd grown up in, and I watched the porch light go dark before I even hit the street. That was the night I stopped knocking. If you've ever stood on the wrong side of a door that should have opened for you, do me a favor and stay with this. Because the part that comes next is the part nobody tells you about, and it's the part I wish someone had told me. We spent the first 4 nights in a motel off the highway, the kind with a parking lot you keep an eye on. It cost $62 a night, which I remember exactly because I recalculated my bank balance every single morning like the number might have improved overnight. It never did. The kids thought it was an adventure. Theo was thrilled that the ice machine was down the hall and would run to get a bucket of ice we didn't need for drinks we didn't have. Nadia knew better. Nadia always knew better. She'd catch my eye across the room while Junie was jumping between the two beds and give me a look that said, "I know, and I'm not going to say anything, and we're going to be okay." 11 years old. The second night was the one that almost got me. Junie spiked a fever around 11, the kind of fast, scary fever little kids get, and I didn't have a thermometer, and the closest pharmacy was 20 minutes away, and I couldn't leave 3 kids in a motel room, and I couldn't wake all 3 and drag them out at midnight. So I did what I'd done for years, without a partner who noticed. I wet a washcloth in the bathroom sink, and I sat on the floor between the 2 beds with Junie in my lap, and I held that cloth on her forehead, and re-wet it, and held it again, for 2 hours, until her skin cooled and she fell back asleep against my chest. Nadia woke up once, saw us on the floor, and climbed down without a word to sit beside me. She didn't ask if Junie was okay. She just leaned her head on my arm and stayed until she fell back asleep, sitting up. I looked at my 2 daughters in the dark of a highway motel, and I felt something in me go very hard and very clear, and it wasn't sadness, it was closer to a decision. I did not have a plan that first week. I had a spiral notebook I bought at a gas station, and I sat on the edge of the motel bathtub after the kids fell asleep, and I wrote down everything I actually had, because everything I'd lost was too big to look at directly. So I looked at what was left instead. I had a job. Part-time in the billing office of a property management company, entering rent payments and chasing down late ones. Not glamorous. Steady. I had 11 years of being the only competent adult in my own household, which turns out to be a skill set. I had a lawyer working on a payment plan. I had 3 healthy kids, and I had a rage that had gone very quiet and very cold, the kind that doesn't burn, the kind that builds. The next Monday, I went into work early and I found my supervisor before I lost my nerve. Her name was Rosalind. She ran the office the way a good coach runs a locker room, tough and fair and impossible to fool. She'd been watching me come in with bags under my eyes and leave last, and I think she'd already guessed most of it. "I need more hours," I told her. "Full-time if there's any way. I'll take whatever nobody else wants." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Sit down, Maren." And she did not ask me a single prying question. She just pulled up a schedule and started moving things around. And by the time I walked out of her office, I had full-time hours, and starting the 1st of the next month, health insurance for me and the kids. I got to my car before I let myself feel it. I sat in the parking lot and put my forehead on the steering wheel and breathed for about a minute. Then I fixed my face and went back to work. Finding an apartment was harder. A single income, a pending divorce, 3 kids, a credit history that had a couple of scorch marks on it from a marriage where I hadn't controlled all the money. 2 places turned me down. The third was a woman named Priya who owned a small 4-unit building and interviewed me at her kitchen table like it mattered, because to her it did. It was a 2-bedroom on the 2nd floor. The kitchen had exactly 1 cabinet door that hung crooked no matter how many times you shut it. The carpet was the color of weak coffee, and when Priya handed me the keys, she held on to them for 1 extra second and said, "You take care of yourself, okay? Not just them. You too." I've thought about that sentence 100 times since. The 4 of us slept on an air mattress and 2 sleeping bags for the first 11 nights. Nadia and Theo shared the 2nd bedroom. Junie slept with me. We ate a lot of scrambled eggs because eggs are cheap and I could make them fast. One night I had $4 in change until payday, and I bought a bag of oranges and a loaf of bread and we made it work, and Junie declared it the best dinner ever, and I laughed for real for the first time in weeks. I ran into my mother once during those first weeks, before the settlement, before anyone in the family knew how any of it would land. It was at the grocery store, the big one on the north side, and I had all 3 kids in a cart with the wheel that pulls left, and I was doing the thing every broke parent does, which is math in the aisle, adding it up in my head before the register can surprise me. I turned the corner into the cereal aisle, and there she was. For a second, neither of us moved. Then Junie, who didn't understand any of it, lit up and shouted, "Grandma!" and started reaching out of the cart. And I watched my mother's face do something I will never forget. She smiled at Junie. She said hello to the kids. She asked Nadia how school was going, and then she looked at my cart, at the store brand everything, at the way I was clearly counting, and instead of asking how we were, instead of asking where we were staying, she said, "You look tired, Maren. Are you sure you're taking care of yourself? Not do you need help. Not where are you sleeping." Just a comment about how tired I looked, delivered with concern that cost her nothing. I said we were fine. I said the kids needed to get home. And I steered my left pulling cart around my own mother in a cereal aisle, and I did not look back, and Junie waved over my shoulder the whole way to the checkout, waving at a woman who would not have taken us in if the four of us had frozen on her porch. I need to say something here, and if you've been the one holding everything together, I need you to actually hear it. There is a myth that when you hit the bottom, someone shows up. A neighbor with a casserole, a relative with an envelope. In my case, nobody showed up. Not one person from that house called to ask if the kids had a bed. My phone stayed quiet, and I want you to know that the silence, as awful as it was, turned out to be a gift, because it meant that everything I built after that, I built without owing anyone a thank you. Our first holiday in that apartment was the hardest day of the whole 18 months, and I almost didn't get through it. It was the kind of holiday my mother used to host, the whole family around her table, the good plates out, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going. Nobody had invited us. I hadn't asked. But knowing the dinner was happening 30 minutes away without us, knowing there were 4 empty chairs where my kids should have been, sat on my chest all morning like a weight. I stood in that little kitchen with the crooked cabinet, and I almost broke. And then Nadia, who at 11 read me better than anyone alive, said, "Can we make our own thing? Just us 4?" So we did. We didn't have a turkey. We made grilled cheese and tomato soup, and we ate it on the living room floor because we still didn't have a table, and Theo declared it the official start of a tradition, and Junie fell asleep in a nest of blankets before dessert. I sat there on the floor of a rented apartment with 3 sleeping and half-sleeping kids in cold soup, and I realized the table I'd been mourning all day had never been mine anyway. This one was. This little circle on the carpet, this was mine, and no one could turn its lights off but me. The divorce took about 10 months, start to finish, and Roland fought parts of it in a way I hadn't expected. He hired a lawyer who was better than mine at first, and they came in with a custody proposal that was, let's say, ambitious. 50-50, equal time. His attorney painted him as a devoted, hands-on father who was being pushed out by a vindictive wife. It was a good performance. It was also, and this is the part that matters, completely unsupported by any evidence because Roland had spent 9 years being the fun parent and none of the actual one, and it turns out that leaves a paper trail. My lawyer, a patient woman named Deb who I could not afford and paid anyway, asked me one question early on that changed everything. She asked, "Who took them to the doctor?" "Me, every time." "Prove it," she said. So I did. I had years of pediatric records with my name and my phone number and my signature on every single form. I had the school as an emergency contact list where Roland's line was blank because he'd never filled it out. I had the daycare sign-in sheets, which listed the parent dropping off and picking up, and mine was the name on nearly every line for 4 years. I had text messages where Roland asked me which kid had the peanut allergy. I had the receipts in the most literal way a person can have receipts. There was a day, about halfway through, when we all had to be at the courthouse for a hearing, and Roland was already in the hallway when I arrived, sitting on one of those wooden benches in a suit I'd never seen, next to a lawyer who kept checking his watch. Roland stood up when he saw me. For a second I thought he might say something real, something like, "I'm sorry," or even "How are the kids sleeping?" And I hated that part of me still hoped for it after everything. Instead, he leaned in close, lowered his voice so his lawyer couldn't hear, and said, "You're really going to do this in front of them? Drag them through all this?" As if I were the one who'd started it. As if the 4 lines I read at a red light had written themselves. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said quietly, "I'm not dragging anyone anywhere. I'm the only one who's been carrying them the whole time." And I walked past him and sat on the far end of the bench, and I didn't shake. And I was almost as surprised by that as he was. The custody evaluator was a no-nonsense woman who interviewed us both and then interviewed the kids separately. And I will never know exactly what my children said in those rooms, but I know that when the recommendation came back, it gave me primary physical custody. Roland got every other weekend and a stretch in the summer. His grand 50-50 performance collapsed under the weight of 9 years of me being the one who showed up. And then there was the money. Because Roland had traveled so much, and because I'd cut my hours over the years to cover the gaps he left, the child support calculation did not go the way his lawyer had promised him it would. He owed support going forward, and he owed a chunk of back support for the months we'd been separated while he was living in his rental posting pictures of his new life. His attorney tried 3 different creative arguments to shrink that number. Deb dismantled all 3. I sat in that conference room and watched a woman I was paying in installments quietly take apart a man who'd spent a decade making me feel small, and I did not smile, because I'd learned by then that the quiet kind of winning doesn't need a smile. It just needs to be true. My family found out about the settlement the way everyone in a small town finds out everything, which is to say, through a chain of people who had no business knowing. And that's when my phone, silent for 10 months, started to buzz again. My mother called first. 10 months of nothing, and then a call on a Tuesday afternoon like no time had passed at all. "We're just so relieved it all worked out," she said, as if she'd been anxiously watching from somewhere close by, as if she'd been in my corner the whole time instead of the person who turned off the porch light. "Are you?" I said. Not a question, just a flat 2 words. "Marin, you have to understand the position we were in." And here's the thing I'd figured out somewhere around month 3, alone in that apartment with the crooked cabinet door. I did understand the position they were in. They were in a position to help their daughter and 3 grandchildren, and they chose not to, because it was inconvenient, because it might have meant Curtis giving up half his television room, because helping me would have required them to admit that Roland was the one who broke the marriage and not me. That was the position they were in. I understood it completely. "I hear you, Mom," I said. "I need some time. I'll reach out when I'm ready." She started to do the thing she does, the sighing, the wounded softness, the suggestion that I was being cold, that family forgives, that we needed to move past this. I let her talk. I've never been able to stop my mother from talking, but when she finished, I just said the same thing again. "I need time. I'll reach out." And I got off the phone, and I did not reach out, and 18 months later, I still haven't set that timeline for anyone but myself. Whitney tried next, about 2 months after the settlement. She sent a message that must have taken her an hour to write. Paragraphs. She'd been doing a lot of thinking. She hadn't handled things the way she wished she had. She hoped we could find our way back to each other. And buried in the middle, so smooth you could almost miss it, was the line where she said she hoped I could understand the place she'd been coming from, which is the sentence people use when they want to be forgiven without actually apologizing. I read it twice. I thought about the hallway and the tilted head and a decision you're making for yourself. Then I wrote back something short and honestly kind. I told her I'd gotten her message and I appreciated it. I told her I wasn't in a place to reconnect yet. I told her that when I was, I'd let her know. She has not stopped since. Every few weeks, another message, each one a little more aware that she got something badly wrong. The most recent one came about a month ago, and it was different from the others. She didn't ask me to understand her side. She just wrote, "I keep thinking about that day in the hallway, and I was wrong, and I'm sorry, and I don't expect you to answer this." That one I actually sat with for a while. It was the first thing anyone in my family had said that sounded like an apology instead of a defense. I haven't answered it yet. I will. But I've learned that the ones worth answering are the ones that don't ask anything of you in return, and I'm in no rush to reward the ones that came before it. I ran into Whitney too once at a farmer's market last summer, both of us reaching for the same table of peaches. It could have been a scene. It wasn't. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and she said, "Your kids look happy." And they did, because they were, off pestering a man selling honey. And I said, "They are." That was the whole conversation. But I noticed she didn't say anything about Roland, or mistakes, or overreacting. She just watched my happy kids for a second with an expression I couldn't quite read, and I think it was the first time she understood, all the way down, exactly what she'd been so quick to talk me out of. I read all her messages. I answer some of them. I answer them slowly and on my schedule, and that pace is the entire point, because for once in my life, I am the one who decides when a door opens. Curtis has never reached out, not once, and I've made my peace with what that silence means. My father sent a birthday card to Junie with a $20 bill in it, and love, Grandpa written inside, and I gave Junie the card and the money, because that's between her and him, and it's separate from everything that's between him and me. That's the closest thing to a bridge that still stands, and I keep it exactly that narrow. I want to tell you about the part where it turned, because there was a turn, and it wasn't loud. About 7 months after the settlement, Rosalind called me into her office again. I'd been reworking how we handled delinquent accounts, mostly because I'd been on the receiving end of enough late notices in my life to know how a scared person reads them, and I'd rewritten our whole process to catch people before they fell too far behind. Collections were up, evictions were down, the owners had noticed. She slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a job description, office operations lead, a real title, a real raise, a number that made me put the paper down and look at her to make sure I'd read it right. "You've been doing this job for 6 months already," Rosalind said. "Might as well get paid for it." I said yes before she finished the sentence. Then I went and sat in my car again, which is apparently where I go to have my feelings. And this time, I didn't put my head on the wheel. I just sat there in the sun for a minute and let it be true. I want to tell you what that job actually became, because it wasn't luck and I don't want you thinking it was. About a year in, one of the property owners we managed for was quietly losing money and couldn't figure out why. 2 other people had looked at his books and shrugged. I spent 3 evenings after the kids were asleep going through his accounts line by line, the way I'd once gone through my own bank balance every morning in that motel, and I found it. A vendor who'd been double billing for 18 months, small enough each time that nobody noticed, big enough over a year and a half to matter. I wrote it up, plainly, no drama, and I brought it to Rosalind, and she brought it to the owner, and he saved more in one afternoon than my salary cost for a year. Nobody handed me anything. I just stopped being afraid to look closely at hard numbers, because I'd already survived the hardest ones I'd ever seen. That raise changed the texture of everything. We moved out of the 2-bedroom with the crooked cabinet into a 3-bedroom townhouse in the same school district, so the kids wouldn't have to change schools again. Nadia got her own room and immediately covered one wall in a corkboard collage of, as far as I could tell, every idea she'd ever had. Theo got a room with a real desk where he taped up maps and calculated the distance from our new place to every other place we'd ever lived, and then to places he wanted to go. Junie, who was 5 by then, got a bunk bed with no top bunk, purely because she thought a ladder to nowhere was the height of luxury. I want to tell you about signing that lease, because it's the closest thing to a trophy I got in all of this. When I'd rented the first apartment, Priya had to look past a shaky credit history and a pending divorce and basically take a chance on me. This time was different. The leasing agent ran my application and came back and said everything looked great, income verified, credit rebuilt, references solid, and handed me the pen like it was nothing, like of course a woman like me would qualify. And I signed my name, my own single name, no cosigner, no husband's income propping it up, no favor from anyone, and I remember the pen felt heavier than it should have. 18 months earlier, I'd been turned away from a house with 4 bedrooms and an empty garage apartment. Now I was signing for one that was entirely, unquestionably mine. And the only name on the paper was the one I'd been slowly, quietly rebuilding from a motel bathtub with a gas station notebook. Theo did a thing around then that I still think about. He was 8 by then, still obsessed with maps and distances, and one night at dinner he announced, apropos of nothing, that he'd figured out we had lived in 4 different places in 1 year. He said it like a scientist reporting a finding: the house, the motel, the first apartment, and here. And then he looked at me, very serious over his plate of spaghetti, and said, "But this one's the longest so far, so I think we're winning." I don't know where an 8-year-old learns to measure safety and how long a place lasts, but he'd learned it, and he'd decided we were winning, and I decided he was right. The townhouse had a small patio out back, nothing special, a concrete slab and a strip of fence, but I bought 2 folding chairs and a pot of tomatoes that I mostly killed, and in the evenings after the kids were down, I'd sit out there with a cup of tea and do the math on what I'd built, and the math kept getting better instead of worse. I opened a savings account. I watched the number in it climb, slowly, then less slowly. Every dollar in it was mine. Not a gift, not a favor, not something I'd have to be grateful for at the next family dinner. Mine. Roland, for what it's worth, actually shows up for his weekends now. I'll give him that. The relationship he'd been building on the side didn't survive contact with reality and fell apart within a year, and I think losing it knocked some of the swagger out of him. He rents a small place across town and takes the kids every other Saturday and returns them on Sunday, and we communicate exclusively by text, and it is efficient and boring, and I would not trade boring for anything. Here is a moment I keep coming back to. 3 weeks ago, Nadia's school had one of those spring showcase nights where the kids display projects in the gym and the parents wander around drinking bad coffee out of paper cups. I went, obviously. I always go. I'm the parent who goes. Nadia, who is 12 now and even more herself than she used to be, had done a project on something called post-traumatic growth, which she explained to me is the idea that some people don't just recover from hard things, they reorganize their whole lives around what they learned. She'd built the whole board herself, researched it herself, and down at the bottom, in her own handwriting, small enough that you'd have to lean in to read it, she'd written a line that wasn't from any of her sources. It said, "The strongest people I know weren't rescued. They just refused to stay down." She was standing next to the board when I got to it, watching my face with that same careful look she'd given me across a motel room a year and a half earlier. "I wrote that part," she said. "The bottom part. That's not from a book." I looked at my daughter, who at 12 years old already understood something it took me 36 years and a dark porch to learn. "I know exactly who you were thinking about," I said. "I know you know," she said. And she went to go stand by the snack table, satisfied, and I stood there in a school gym pretending the coffee was in my eyes. I don't tell you any of this, so you'll feel sorry for me. I have a job with my name on the title, a savings account that grows, a townhouse with a patio and some dead tomatoes, and 3 kids who are loud and strange and completely themselves, and who have no idea, none at all, how much it costs to give them a boring, stable, ordinary life. That's the whole prize. They think this is just how things are. They think the ground under them was always solid. That's what I was building the entire time. The people who closed that door on me are living the exact same lives they were living 18 months ago. Same house, same basement, same Sunday dinners with one fewer chair that nobody mentions. My mother still keeps the frame photos marching up the staircase, and there's still one of me up there from the year I had braces and hope. I think about that picture sometimes, a version of me who assumed those people would catch her if she ever fell. They didn't catch me. I want to be honest about how much that broke something in me that I'm not sure will fully heal, but I also want to be honest about the other thing, the thing I couldn't have known while I stood on that welcome mat with a sleeping 4-year-old getting heavier on my shoulder. Not being caught meant I had to learn I could stand on my own, and once you learn that, truly learn it, in your body, at $2 until payday, nobody can ever hold it over you again. I stopped waiting for an apology a long time ago, not because they don't owe me one. They do. My mother owes me one, and my father owes me one, and Curtis owes me one for that laugh, and Whitney owes me one for the tilt of her head. But I figured out something that I'd give a lot to have known sooner. Waiting for an apology is just another way of standing on the porch. It's another way of keeping your hand raised, ready to knock. And I put my hand down 18 months ago, and I have never once been sorry. So here's what I want to ask you, whoever you are, wherever you're listening from. If someone who was supposed to open a door for you ever let it click shut in your face, I want to know what you did next. Did you keep knocking? Or did you finally turn around and go build your own? Tell me in the comments because I read them, and because I promise you this community understands something the whole world tried to make me forget for 36 years. The people who tell you there's no room for you are almost never telling you the truth about the room. They're telling you the truth about their fear. They're afraid of who you'll become the day you stop asking them for space and go make your own. And if this is landing somewhere real for you tonight, do one thing before you go. Subscribe and stay with me, because the next story I'm going to tell you is about the day, 6 months from now, when one of those doors tried to open again from the inside and what I decided to do about it. You're going to want to be here for that. I stopped knocking a year and a half ago. And the quiet on the other side of that decision turned out to be the sound of my own life finally beginning.